Welcome back to all of you to this afternoon session of the first day of the summer seminar on research integrity. We have now, before the coffee break, two speakers and three presentations, so we make it slightly more complex. One of the speakers is Tamarinde Haven, the other one is Joeri Tijdink. First, Tamarinde will tell you about pre-registration. That topic was raised already this morning by Marianne Bakker, but she will make it more practical and also dwell on data analysis plan and publishing of data. Then the second half hour after a Q&A, so please type again your questions in the Q&A box during the presentation. That's more easy for us, and then we can make an assortment for the discussion afterwards. And then Joeri takes over on making a publication plan, which we believe to be important, but how can you do it? And does it really help to solve or even prevent disputes among alleged authors? And then Tamarinde comes back again and she will share a lot of stuff from her PhD thesis she defended last year in Amsterdam, and that is on superb supervision, mentoring, role modeling, all the things that we have been discussing this morning already as being really important drivers of the behavior we'd like to see in investigators. Before I give them the floor, I'd like to introduce them both briefly, and they will interact with each other during the presentations as well, so you better know who is who. Tamarinde, as I said already, defended her PhD thesis in Amsterdam on research climate, and she studied Amsterdam as well, the two universities and the two university medical centers. Now she moved on to Berlin, not only to learn German, but also to do research in the Quest Center, which is focusing on research and research on research integrity as well, mainly biomedical, but not exclusively. And Tamarinde also spent some time, although it was digital already during the Corona thing, in the Center of Open Science, that also was alluded to by Marianne Bakker this morning, and there she developed the pre-registration forms and rhythms for qualitative research. Joeri is an assistant professor in the philosophy department and also in the law, ethics and humanities, medical humanities department of the Amsterdam University Medical Center. He is doing research on research integrity. He did his PhD thesis a number of years ago on that as well. He's also interested in mental health in academia, research culture. He was one of the supervisors of Tamarinde as well as such. He developed a questionnaire and that was validated recently again on publication pressure, and he is an advocate of open science. And you should not forget that he is a psychiatrist as well. Joeri wrote a book called Scholar on the Sofa. He puts us under psychoanalysis, and we can learn quite a lot of it. The English version of that book is imminent next year, I believe. And he is one of the leading work package leaders of that SOPS4RI project I alluded to this morning during the opening presentation. So now, without further ado, I give the floor to Tamarinde to enlighten us on how and how not to pre-register. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And yeah, today is up to me to show you a little bit more about the practical side of pre-registration. I am very grateful for Marianne Bakker to give a great overview this morning, so I can talk about a little bit more of the practical aspects, and I'll also dwell a little bit on do's and don'ts when it comes to data sharing. So here on the slide, like behind me, you'll see the typical pre-registration batch. And I'll also show you a little bit closer example. Here is a paper from authors from the Journal of Psychological Science, and whoop, there you go. There you can actually see already and spot as an author that this work has been pre-registered. Now, the structure of my talk will be as follows. I'll dwell only a slightly little bit on the relevance of pre-registration data sharing. I'll go into the types of pre-registration that are out there, and we have quite a few now, as Marianne already alluded to. Then I'll talk about the different registries associated, and I'll walk you through an actual example and some tips and tricks if you are considering pre-registering your work. And finally, I'll give some tips on data sharing. But first, why on a day when it comes to research integrity are we focusing about pre-registration, about data sharing? And I think I can illustrate it rather nicely with a picture of this man, that's Dirk Stapel, whom I can say has really fueled the debate on research integrity, at least within the Netherlands. And the two particularities relevant here for us. One is that Stapel was found guilty of fabricating and falsifying his data. So in other words, there was no such thing as a pre-registration plan or a data analysis plan. And also, there was frankly often even no data. So I think that his case already illustrates rather nicely that these are two things that we should pay particular attention to. Now, why are people then so enthusiastic about pre-registration? And what I put up on this slide here is the empirical cycle that I reckon many of us familiar with scientific method are ourselves very familiar with. And this is a sort of traditional way in school that many of us are taught to do scientific research, at least when we come to the more from the more sort of quantitative and confirmatory side of research. But as you can see here, there are a number of sort of biases, mistakes, researchers' degrees of freedom, and other perks that may jump in or that may creep in at various points of this cycle. And therefore, it helps that we are very attentive to those, and there are particular ways of doing that and making ourselves more aware. And one is pre-registration. So pre-registration is thought to reduce what Marianne has nicely labeled the researcher degrees of freedom by sort of limiting all those seemingly arbitrary choices that you make along the way of analysing your results. And it's also thought to mitigate publication bias, and that is because there is a public time-stamped record of your research hypothesis out there. And even if it's published or not, then at least people know that this work may not have been there, but there may have been additional research on this particular question. And it's thought that because this regards a public and a time-stamped version, that it's thought to strengthen the credibility and transparency of your work. And that is because you as a researcher, if you know this is going to put out there for public scrutiny, you think twice before you write something up. And also you have to be thinking about the fact that someone else will be seeing this and they will have to be able to actually make sense of what you've been doing. And those are at least two of the ways in which we think that it might help that. And of course, I think Marianne also already alluded to this, we see the importance of pre-registration being recognised by various stakeholders. And here what I have in mind is journals like Psychological Science that I put up on the first slide that encourage this practice. You can also think of different funders like the Arnold Foundation that may even mandate the work that they fund to be pre-registered. And you also see this along different scholarly societies. Now, I thought I want to know a little bit about what sort of audience I am talking for. And this morning in Marianne's talk, we got a lot of questions about how to do a pre-registration. So it made me wonder, whom of you has pre-registered a study before? And therein, I'm inviting you to go to menti.com and to use this code, that is, if all goes well, shown on the screen and also put in the chat, so that hopefully we'll get a little bit of a sense in what sort of virtual room I'm talking for and what knowledge is already present in that room. And we can already see some results coming in. Wow, we have a lot of new people. That is very great, because that actually means that what I'm going to say in the remainder of this talk can be of relevance for you. But I'm also seeing some more and more pre-registration experts already entering the game. It's shifting nicely, but at least still so far, the majority of you has not tried this practice before. Oh, it's pushing. Okay, then for those 7 people that are already experts, I expect very thought-provocative questions from you in the Q&A. But maybe we can move on already. And then I can say a little bit about the different types of pre-registration that are already out there. So maybe let's start with the sort of clinical trials ones. So in 2005, the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors actually mandated that all of the clinical trials that were published in their journals had to be registered. And I think many of you also know that in the United States, if you're doing any sort of trials, it has to be registered via clinicaltrials.gov. And in Europe, we're seeing a similar thing for drug-related trials. And in recent years, this movement has also been pushed towards animal studies and actually registering your animal studies in an attempt to let researchers already think prospectively about taking also different quality strengthening measures and specifying those, and potentially also allowing other researchers along the way to learn from a lot of the mistakes that they had to make. Then, as Marianne already alluded to, this practice of registering your results and putting that registry on a public platform has been expanded to a lot of quantitative research. So there you have to think about cross-sectional research or maybe observational research, what many of us in the social and behavioral sciences also do, but also in epidemiology and medicine. And recently, I've been myself involved in thinking about if we can extend this practice in a meaningful way to qualitative research. And I can tell you, as was probably true for cognitive modeling and fMRI, that requires a lot of rethinking, but that there are very useful bits that can be transferred and I believe can also help strengthen the credibility and transparency of qualitative research. Now, on those registries, what you see here on the top is the registries that if you're thinking about, okay, I might be doing a trial next year, where should I go? Well, I put up here the sort of most common ones. And the ICTRP is, as many of you perhaps know after last year, the registry from the World Health Organization. And that sort of goes across different nations. And then here, Germany was actually the first one to launch a registry specifically designated to animal studies. That can be found if you just Google sort of these terms. And then we have the two sort of broader registries out there. So the OSF has already been mentioned, and another registry that allows for relatively short pre-registration is the As Predicted. But I was thinking some of you may also be doing slightly different work. So if you're considering conducting a systematic review, then I would recommend you to go to Prospero. And with that in place, I thought before we start with discussing this further and showing you a couple of challenges and some examples, I first thought, and this is especially for those 7 people, when you pre-registered your work, what sort of challenges did you face? Because I think especially for the new people, they may be having already a lot of challenges in their head, so please put them in. But especially for those 7 people that had already pre-registered their work, inform us about your challenges so that these new people can hopefully learn from you, and I'll see if I can connect them to some of the challenges I tried to address in this talk. And this time you might notice that you're just free, if all goes well, that you're free to type in a word so you can phrase your own challenge. But I'm hoping that we'll also see some common challenges appear. And I do realize this is a slightly more complex question, but maybe you can remember something that you struggled with or some issues that you have been discussing with your team when preparing this. A lot of work. There we go. These are the practical challenges, but they need to be on there. Unspecified theory. That's also related to this morning, actually, what Marianne was talking about. Planning errors, how to work in front of project. I wonder what COVID delays means here, but we might talk about it in the Q&A. Error of judgment. Anxious to miss things. I think those are least familiar to me personally. The sufficient level of detail is actually also a very, very interesting one, and it's hard to give you a quick answer to that. But this actually already nicely feeds into 2 of the sort of main challenges that I tried to think about beforehand. So maybe changing the plan. Changing the plan is actually a beautiful bridge. Okay, let me walk you through my challenges. So often when I talk with people about pre-registration, the first thing they're afraid of is, okay, so I put my work out there, and then what if someone else comes along and thinks that's a nice plan, and they'll just do it quicker. They'll have more power, they'll have a greater lab, they'll have more capacity. And then all my work is out there. I've made this whole plan with due diligence, and someone's there to take it. I'll be scooped. And to that I want to say, you can embargo your work for like a pre-specified time. You can actually say, this is not visible. And then by the time that you are ready to put it up as a preprint or to put it up as a publication, then you can actually release it. So this is one way of mitigating that potential fear of being scooped by someone else. And then another thing that you talked about in relation to, you know, what if I miss something? What if I need to change something? What if I had an error of judgment? Update. Update is the work. And there are two ways I have in mind here. One is, of course, that you can transparently, in your paper, describe these sort of deviations. But I can feel into the fact that some of you may be thinking, yeah, but I made a really trivial mistake. Should I put it out there? And what I can tell you is that you can also add small descriptions to your pre-registration. You cannot change it, but you can add description to it that will explicate to the reader what you have changed and what sort of small bits and pieces you have actually updated. Now, if you now think, okay, cool, I might want to try this, then there are a few resources I want to point out to you. So this is taken from the website of the OSF. If you look for pre-registration and scroll down, you'll find very small here, and it reads example pre-registrations. And I think a lot of the questions this morning were also triggered by, but what does this look like in practice, right? So I really recommend you to check this out. Then this is such an example. So you can already see, you'll see first a little bit of like meta-ish data about the study, the research question, the hypotheses. And then if you were to scroll down, you'll see a lot more about the actual variables that people sampled and so on. So now say that you think, I want to give this a go. And I'll go through the OSF example because it's still a fairly complex one. And I'm taking all of this from creating a pre-registration guide. So it first asks you, do you already have a project? And if you don't, you can still pre-register. And it asks you what type of registration you would like to create. And there we go. So first, when you start this, you might want to add a little bit of metadata, so about the title, the field, the discipline. And this is also in relation to that mitigating publication bias, right? We do want your work to be findable. Then we'll go into the next step of describing your research, your plan. You'll specify your variables, the way you sample, and so on. And as you can see here, it often asks you to maybe select something, describe something yourself, and you can also add files at particular places. And then, say you're all ready, then it asks you, okay, review. And this is a point where I would actively like to invite you to please bring in your team. Not many of us are working alone in these fields. And this is a very good point of bringing in your team and reviewing this together. Also to have some sort of internal consensus of, do we really mean the same thing here? Is this the way we want to go forward? And then, of course, when you've done all of that, it's time to register. And here comes that part on the embargoing that I talked about earlier. Just before you're done, OSF will ask you just if you want to make it immediately public or if you want to put it under a specific embargo. So if that is something that you would like to explore, this is the moment you have to be mindful of that option. Because otherwise, you have about 24 hours and then it is out there, non-editable forever. So let's look. Continue this hypothetical situation. You have done all your work, you've pre-registered all your work, you've done your study, you've written up the results, and now you want to publish and you want to submit your work, and you also want to share your data. And I thought instead of lecturing you very traditionally about the importance of doing that, I'll share about 5 things that I personally struggled with and nearly made mistakes with when it comes to good research data management and sharing your data. And the first is having a research data management plan. And I notice this is now more and more involved and enforced also at different places, and there's training about that. But it wasn't the case for a very long time. So, get yourself familiar with all of this, because it really helps, I have found, to know from the start also what sort of things are offered at your institution. Maybe you've taken a very great class about research data management, you've learned it all, and then you learn that your institution doesn't even offer this type of repositories. So make yourself already aware when you want to start a project, what sort of data am I going to gather, how can I store it, what sort of options are out there for me. And this is a sort of famous paper in this area, but it's really good for helping you to check if you thought and consider all the sort of relevant things when making a good research data management plan. And another thing when it comes to especially preparing your data is the typical FAIR acronym. And I know this sounds fuzzy, but I always tend to think that we're moving more and more in a world where we're moving towards a future where we don't just want humans to be able to work with our data, we also want machines to work with our data and want machines to do the work for us. So part of the challenge of FAIR is making sure that even a machine could get away with using your data. And here again, there's a comment of sort of, but put this really on the agenda, and it describes it rather luminantly how and what you should do. Then there is a challenge of choosing the right format when you want to disseminate your work. And I've asked around a few people that have reused data from others, and they described some typical struggles, many of them. And the first is, please do not use, now I'm talking about the sort of file extensions when you're going to make them public. Don't use .saf, which is a typical way that SPSS will save your data, but use CSV so that other people can actually work with it. And a very similar thing regards for sharing if you have maybe qualitative data like I do, use a docx extension or a text extension and not a PDF, because you're limiting the workability for people from the get-go. And of course, when you want to put it out there and you want other people to maybe reuse some of your variables, you might want to think, well, of adding a code book and putting this maybe somewhere online for people to be found. And with a code book, I just mean very simple things about defining, like, this is the label of a variable in my data set, and this is what we meant or how we measured it. Because it can be very tricky, even if you think that you've done it all very carefully. Don't make a puzzle for others. And this is always a good phase to bring in a naive colleague and ask him or them whether they can make sense of your data. And finally, the licensing, that's also getting more and more important in this particular world. So here I put up a typical, the sort of very ideal way of licensing, but this can be a messy thing, and not all journals make it sort of equally clear. So I wanted to end on referring all of you, the NWO, I think, has recently produced this guide into different types of licenses, but it's really helpful to familiarize yourself with that, because you might even find out that your supervisor doesn't know. And last but not least, on all of these complicated data matters, please ask for help. I know the university I used to work have had research data management support, but almost all of them have. We even have national networks now in the Netherlands and in Europe and elsewhere. And there are a lot of dedicated people that really want to help you to share your work in a responsible way. And I hope that has given you some quick ideas and insights, and I'm looking forward to provocative questions. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for this instructive and also practical presentation. I'm almost sure that you make some more people willing to try pre-registration. And it was interesting to see that 1/4 of the population had done it before, which is exactly the same we found in the Dutch National Survey on Research Integrity.
Oh, that's lovely.
So it's quite nice. Just one remark, Erin McCree, he wrote about COVID delays, and he was referring to Prospero, which is the registry of systematic reviews that was offline for 6 months, doing nothing, and then accepted everything. So that he was referring to. Do you know whether that happens in other registrations as well?
I happen to not know on the spot. I can imagine it, but I haven't really heard of it through the grapevine either. So sorry, no, I have to stay silent.
No, practical stuff. Now, there is this interesting question of Savik Dasgupta. And he says, well, this is interesting what you say, Tamarinde, about embargoing. Who is putting an embargo there? Who decides how long the embargo can be? Who is allowed to lift it? How does it work?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I do realize I should be more practical here. So the very simple answer is, you as an author put the embargo. If you want, the sort of T's and C's here are a little bit more complicated, and they are that, for example, registries like the OSAF do have embargo limits. So it means that I believe you can embargo your work up to 4 years. Because of course the idea is ultimately to make your methods more open, more reproducible, and to make your work more traceable. So you do this as an author, you get to decide, you get to fill in that date, you get to flip that switch, but there is a sort of an ultimate end that it will happen.
Yeah, that makes it clear. And by the way, this is also the way to establish priority. Have an embargoed pre-registration shows that you were the first to have the idea, which is opposite to some of the criticism to pre-registration.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now there is this other intriguing question. The theme, I haven't read it myself. It's coming from Alma Linkevich-Chiute again. Not sure about the pronunciation. She says in British Medical Journal, recently a few papers appeared, that for people from low and middle income countries, it is already a hassle and difficult to pre-register. Is it nice to have another hurdle being put in front of researchers from these less privileged countries? Do you recognize that a bit?
I think I can recognize it to some extent. I would like to know specifically what sort of additional hurdles they perceived. Because I do want to emphasize that the services that have been put up here are free to use. And I do realize they depend partially on reliable internet, which is a tricky one. But I want to prevent any confusions that these services are things that universities or institutions have to pay for or researchers have to pay for. But maybe I'm then completely missing the mark on this question.
No, that doesn't matter. She will know where to find you
absolutely. Please ask
pursue
me.
the discussion offline. So please feel invited to do so. There is another issue that has been raised, and it intrigues me myself as well. You have established, we in the National Survey have established that only 25% have done it once or twice or sometimes. So there is a world to win. How are we going to win that world? What is your strategy? Nudging, making it more mandatory, more interesting talks like you did today, or what is the way to move the world towards pre-registration of hypothesis testing research?
I think we're already seeing it change in the new generation of early career researchers, where the rate of acceptance is a lot higher. And I don't have the data on this, but I suspect also the people within your national survey that that PhD candidates were presumably overrepresented in that approximately 1/4 of people that did pre-register their work. So I feel like to some extent there is already there's a new tide coming in. But if we still want to change some of the old matters, I'm inclined to say that we just need phenomenally good examples. We need people to indeed speak up about this, but we also need to do, maybe now that we feel in relation to the talk we had before by Daniel Lakens, maybe with these sort of matters, let's tackle the questions that really matter. Let's take on those sort of hard questions. And then if we pre-register them and then show some of these things robustly, I think that can be a great way forward and get more people on the bandwagon.
Good point. And you want to add to that, Joeri?
Yeah. Well, of course, we can learn something from the field of clinical trials.
Yes.
And we did some research on that as well about pre-registration. There you see an upward trend, and quite a lot, because in the early 2000s, you didn't see any registration, but then the FDA wanted all the researchers in the US to register their trials on clinicaltrials.gov, so that increased the rate of actual pre-registrations. So I think we're really on the right track. And you see this steep incline in the last years of registering the clinical trials. So I hope that this will continue, and not only in the field of clinical trials, but also in the other fields. And I totally agree with Tamarinde.
So your answer seems to be, make it mandatory. FDA made it mandatory because otherwise your drug cannot enter the market. And funding agencies make it mandatory. When you take the money, you have to pre-register. Yeah. So no education, no other types of tricks, just make it mandatory. Is that what you're saying?
I tend to agree to that strategy. Of course, there are country differences. We see it with COVID vaccination, for example. But in the US, it works. It works to a certain extent. Of course, not 100%, but it works.
And maybe one final question to Tamarinde. Why bother about pre-registration? Why not go the whole way and do a registered report?
So the very pragmatic answer is that you might not be able to publish your registered report everywhere at this point. And yeah, to some extent, it is a step further. And I think we're seeing more and more acceptance of this other model. maybe I can say that if you're novel to this practice, try a pre-registration first. And let me end on that to hopefully get a lot of people on board with the feeling that they don't have to work a lot more.
Yeah, I like that answer. It's a kind of grow model. It will grow over time. Great. Thank you very much again. Tamarinde, you will be back with us later today. Now we move on to Joeri. Joeri will present, and I've been introducing him already, about making a publication plan that might prevent and might help to solve issues between people who think they are allowed and should be an author. Joeri, the floor is yours. This is a highly relevant topic again.
Yeah, and also a highly emotional topic, I would say, because to be honest, authorships are a dear subject of mine to talk about, because this is what makes researchers tick. It motivates researchers, and it is one of the key, I would call it the currency how academia works. And there's so a lot of things and a lot of things that are involved in responsible authorship or ethical authorship. So that's why I'm very happy to talk about it today, about how we can solve these authorship disputes, because it is common, and I will zoom into the data on that as well. And then how can we prevent them? At least how can we try to prevent them by making a publication plan, which is also one of the things that we have included in the course that Tamarinde is going to talk about, the Superb Supervision course. And this is one of the things that we learn supervisors how to make it and how to use it in their daily practice. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to talk about being an author. We're going to talk about my experience as a researcher. It's a little bit small, so I have trouble. I'm getting old, so that's really a thing. So the next point is the authorship dance or the authorship battle. We're going briefly go into. We're going to talk about what is exactly credit and when credit is due. We are going into the journal criteria for authorship, and we're also going to zoom into the credit criteria for authorship. What are they exactly? And then we talk about the incidences of authorship disputes. We talk about measures, how we can prevent them, and we're going to talk about measures how we can deal with those disputes. And finally, we will talk about how we can work with a publication plan. So this is a great word cloud about how people perceive the authorship battle. So the question was, describe in one word, what is your experience with authorship assignment? So people come up with a lot of different words, positive, but also quite some negative. It's complicated and it's confusing. So I think these two words, they do. This is also something that where I have experience with, but also where a lot of my colleagues have experience with, because you hear it all the time around you that people are struggling with authorships about who should be on the paper, who should not be on the paper, who should get the first authorship, who should get the first or the last authorship. It is something very important in academia. And I always use this figure not only to describe or show you the road for how you come to a publication, but it also shows us, and now I use it in a different way, that the guys in the doctor's coat, those are your co-authors, and here you have 4 on the paper, but oftentimes, you also have a lot of other authors that are on the authors list that may not have contributed that much as the guys in the white jacket. And why this I want to show you this is that there is a lot of it's so difficult to really determine what are the real contributions of authors to a specific paper. Why is it so important then? I think most of you know, but I will briefly go into all the details about authorships. It is of course, it's the most important way to show your academic work to the world. As you all know, research is a very long endeavor with a lot of different steps, but this is the end product. This is what you can show to the rest of the world. And luckily, we now also have pre-registration, which you can show to the world, which are findable, and a lot of other things, but this is the end product. And this is where you, most of the time, where you're most proud of. And of course, it plays a pivotal role in the assessment criteria. Luckily, we are changing a little bit the assessment criteria in academia, but still, it is one of the key factors how we determine a researcher, how we judge and assess a researcher. So, therefore, authorships are extremely important if you want to pursue a career in science. And of course, credit where credit is due. This is something extremely important because we always feel that if we have contributed to something, that we want to be part of the research and that we want to get credited, because how else would you, if you want to work, you want to visualize what you have done, and a publication is the core element of all the research that you've done and that you have been involved in. So credit where credit is due is important. It is, as I said, the main currency to reward academic credits. Of course, it is also a political, there's a political element in authorships. There are a lot of differences in both in academic disciplinary fields with different ways how people deal with authorship. Of course, there's a lot of country differences that needs to be acknowledged. In some countries, the first author is the professor that leads the whole research endeavor, while in other, like for example the Netherlands, the first author is most of the time the person who does most of the work, or is the PhD student. So there are a lot of country differences and also a lot of disciplinary differences in authorship, but in most countries, this is what also Kuyper is saying, in most countries the first author is the person who does most of the work, and the last author is the person who supervises the work, who supervises the research project. But still, there's a lot of political influence on the decisions who is going to be the author. And sometimes, and that's PhD students get begrudged by this, is that at the end, sometimes a new author comes on the horizon and will be part of the authorship team without significant contribution. That is something that is still prevalent. And which PhD students find very well, they're irritated by it. So, as I said, the country differences, there are a lot of unwritten rules about these authorships and authorship places. I already said about the first and last authorship, but there are a lot of things that what is exactly the value of the second authorship or the third authorship. You see a lot of shared first authorships or co-corresponding authors. So there are a lot of things how people are dealing with this credit issue. How can we acknowledge the work that people have put in different papers? It can make or break collaborations. As I said, it's highly emotional sometimes, authorships, because it can influence your career, it can influence your, thus it can influence also your collaborations. And if you are not seen in specific collaborations, it can really affect how you collaborate with others and how you collaborate in future research projects. And that's also funny. There's an overestimation of how much your own contributions. Daniel Lakens told us about the vacuum cleaner and about the house course, and I think we tend to overestimate the work that we put at home in the course to have a more or less equal balance between the person you're living with, and it's the same in authorships. we think that we do more than we actually did. So we overestimate our own contributions. And as I said, I cannot stress this enough. It is. I think it's the most emotional part of our work, being or not being an author. How to do the authorship battle or something, the authorship dance. I think this sometimes comes with a lot of emotions. Oh, now I have to go all the way down here, and we go to the next slide. I think this is a very important time because these are the official journal criteria for authorship. We, as you see here, it is a substantial contribution. So there's 4 factors, and I would like to stress 2 different things. One is substantial contributions, and the word substantial, which is something that you really can debate, because what is a substantial contribution? Some people think that a substantial contribution is that you have attended a meeting where the research was discussed, and that was a substantial contribution. And some people think that only a substantial contribution is that you actually were available, that you supervised, that you were involved in all the steps in the research. And other people consider that a substantial contribution. And the other thing, I think it's also very interesting how it's written here, drafting the work or revising it critically for important intellectual content. Some people consider reviewing it critically for important intellectual content. Some people really consider that you have to go all the way and zoom into the nitty-gritty of the paper, while others consider a critical review that they have changed their affiliation because they were not spelled right. So this is something, and that's why I'm highlighting this, the ICMGA criteria are really very debatable. So, and the third and the fourth point is the final approval, of course, and the agreement to be accountable. Those are the 4 criteria. So these criteria are debatable. So that's why the Harvard University and the Wellcome Trust decided, well, we need to have better authorship statements, because it's not good. And those criteria, they work. They are officially how we deal with that, but it's not really workable in practice. So so they came up with new criteria about the design of the research. And because of time issues, here you see an overview of all the important points that you see that can be rewarded and can be acknowledged in the research process. So it goes from the initial start of about hypothesis testing all the way to the final approval of the research. And I think this is a next step, apart from those ICMG criteria, is that this really helps authors to decide who did what exactly, and that you can see from the outside perspective. If you publish these criteria, that you can see what were the actual contributions to a specific paper. Of course, this is not mandatory. This is for some journals, they really use it. Elsevier, for example, is trying to really implement these criteria. But I think this is a better way to really acknowledge what people did in the research process. So the question then is, what can we do to improve this highly debatable structure of authorship? And I think that one of the key things is that we can, that if you discuss prospectively the expectations for authors, I think that could really help you to decide who should be an author and who should not be an author. Secondly, you have to accept that authorships are flexible, so it changes over time. Contributions change over time. People get different roles in the research process. So take that into account. And also power disbalances and conflict of interest can really interfere in the decision who should be the author of a paper, and it can derail, as you have to acknowledge, in questionable research practices, because a gift or a ghost authorship or honorary authorship is something that is prevalent, pretty prevalent to be honest, and it is. We consider that also a questionable research practice, and it is extremely common. So let's go to the Mentimeter. Here you see the website, and we have 2 questions for you. So I'll give you the time to fill in go to the website and fill in this code, and to answer the question about authorships, about disputes. There you go. Did you have an authorship dispute? Well, there you go. Yes, this is already something that is. I will already zoom into the. This is something that the literature says. This how it is, how common it is, and here you see that almost 3/4 of the participants have been in an authorship dispute. Yes, so that's why it's highly prevalent, and thus it is important to talk about it and to talk, because one of the things that are extremely important is that we should talk about these disputes, that authorship is so delicate that we have to talk about it with our supervisors, that we have a plan, in this case the publication plan, how we deal with it. We go directly to the next Mentimeter. Or I have to ask the people from above. Well, we're sitting here, but the people from above do the technique. So, well, this is on a 1 to 5 Likert scale. How do you feel about this dispute? Of course, on the left, very happy, and on the right is very dissatisfied, if I see it correctly. Yeah, bad. Yeah, so it is, there you, again, although the numbers are small, people feel bad about their disputes. And I can imagine, because sometimes it feels not fair, it feels that people are not acknowledged properly. So I can imagine that people feel it this way. And it is, a dispute is quite common. So let's go to the next slide. So it is between 35 and 65% of the researchers have been involved in this agreement. So that's quite common, and it's almost 8% of the retractions that are due to authorship disputes. Also quite common there. And the third thing is that in research integrity offices, we see it very often that there are disputes on it. I would like to go directly now to the publication plan, because we're running out of time, and I think how we should solve them. Cope has several ideas about it, how we can improve it, and we say that a publication plan can really help. So let's directly go to the publication plan here. This is an example of, coincidentally, a publication plan that I supervised and that my colleagues were also involved in. And this is what we do. So beforehand, we start with outlining what are the papers that we are going to describe, and some preliminary titles on it. And that we make a plan, we make a timeline when we're going to publish this, when we're going to write it, and we also ask all the potential authors whether they want to be involved as an author. We do this beforehand. So we ask everyone openly, hey, these are all the papers that we're going to write. You are the whole research team. Let us know if you want to be involved as an author, and then we can work together. So beforehand, we already know who wants to take up the task of being an author, being involved in the writing, being involved in revising the articles. So I think this can really help you to decide beforehand who is going to be involved or not. And the second thing is you have to be flexible in this because, as I said in earlier, things change. I mean, collaboration change. People start having new appointments, are shifting to other research projects. So I think it's very important that that you are flexible in this, and that it might change, or that you add an author because someone is an expert in his field, and you ask him to be involved in writing certain parts, or being involved in the methods of a specific research or in the analysis. So it can change, but it's very good that you make this beforehand, and that you really set out the expectations that you expect from someone to be a first, second, or last author, but also that you're flexible and that you can change it according to the contributions that are there. And then you can prevent a lot of disputes, because people won't feel, hey, you forgot me, or hey, someone said they wanted to be involved and be involved in the writing process but didn't do anything. Well, then you can say, well, you do not fulfill the criteria. It's better to put you in the acknowledgement section, for example. So to summarize, these are the do's and don'ts. So the do's are the do's are that you have a regular update on a plan, that you be flexible about it, that you take responsibility when you are actually on the list, and the don'ts are don't take the publication plan, that you don't take it serious. So you have to take it serious, and that you have to update it. And it's also the don't that you forget someone who actually was in the publication plan but didn't involve him in the writing process. So my colleagues are back, so that means that we have plenty of time for discussion. I really hope that there are some good questions that we can answer and talk about in the discussion section.
Thank you very much, Joeri. Thanks for this interesting and also very practical presentation. In a way, this is an open nerve, especially of early research, early career researchers. I've been teaching, like you have been, many courses for research on research integrity, and people always start complaining about all the tricks they were engaged with in reality, and it hit them from an unexpected error. So maybe such a plan might work. The question is, you're a psychiatrist, of course. Does personality have something to do with it? Do different personality types engage in a different way in these tricky negotiations, do you believe?
Well, yeah, it is. I think a good supervision comes here around the corner as well, because I really think that you should give a good example by really practicing what you preach, and practicing the fact that you work with publication plans, and that you know what the expectations are. But that's not your question. Your question is indirectly well, I read it this way. What about narcissistic leaders who wants to take all the credit, for example? Or what about the lifters?
You and I know them.
Yeah, we know them. And or what about the lifters that are just sitting there once or twice in a meeting, and then they say that they want to be part of the publication team, or want to have an authorship? It definitely plays a role, and it also, and that's why such a publication plan can really help. Because if you have this expectation, you have something on paper, which you have with a publication plan, that it can prevent that people start being part of an author. At least you have evidence that was not the pre-assumption that someone should be involved, and that at least helps PhD students to at least give them at least some support that they should take that plan serious, and say to the supervisor, hey, this is not right. We should do it differently. And then still the narcissistic leader would say, I don't care, I'm the boss of the department, I should be the last author. Well, sometimes you have to be flexible in that, and PhD students are not in the position to, they unfortunately, they're not in the position to be, to really make a big debate about it. And that's why the responsibility is really with the supervisors. Yeah.
But swallowing is an option, and then we can, well, refer these people to you for a consultation.
Of course, I would be happy, because it is, to be honest, it is one of the key reasons why I entered the area of research integrity, because I found it so intriguing that people, like middle-aged men, were fighting over a third authorship position. Well,
Mahdi Khalidi has an interesting angle to this. He says, well, is this not only about symptoms? Why do we bother talking about authorships anyway still?
Yeah, of course she's completely right, because it's just a name that's on a list somewhere online. But it is so much more complicated, unfortunately, or fortunately. It is so complicated because it really, some publications in high impact factor journals can still make or break your career. So that's why you want to be involved in certain publications, and you really want to be an author. And besides that, people really still assess you on the how much output you have on the Web of Science or on PubMed. So being an author is so important for your career, and that's why are people still fighting for it. And that's something that we cannot change. And I'm not sure whether we should change that system, because I think it's, on the one hand, it's a good way to at least see that people are active and people do something and people are really working hard. But it really has perverse, it creates perverse incentives for hitchhikers, for example.
And you seem to suggest, Joeri, that more granularity helps, like the credit system. Do you really believe that? Because it's quite arbitrary, and the whole game starts all over again, but now at 15 different levels.
Yeah. Well, at least we have some evidence what are the contributions are. So, for example, if you're on a 50-author Nature paper as an author, and you only did a very tiny part, and you put it in a grant proposal, and people say, wow, he was in Nature, that must be very special. And then you zoom into that publication, and you only see that this person was involved in a very tiny part of that research. Then at least you have some idea about this the role of this person in that publication and in the quality of the work. So you can see more, but then still, it is arbitrary, and it's still, although there were 15 criteria, there's still a lot of work that is not described. For example, about collaboration or about more the soft skills of researchers.
You want to weave in, Tamarinde?
Yeah, I also wanted to add that it may help us to look more at these sort of systems already, like the credit one, focus or direct our attention a little bit more towards the conduct of the study. And I think it's really important that I'm with Joeri, that I don't think authorship goes away, but I think we're moving more and more towards a place where we also really look at the conduct of the specific study that the person is an author on. And that is where these sort of things already help to direct us towards that and to let people take explicit ownership of the way a work was conducted. And I hope that in the future we also evaluate more the way the work was conducted and less the sort of citability of the work. And I believe these systems feed into that.
Well, that makes sense to me at least. Joshua Hapgood, he says, well, what can we do to empower the victims, the early career researchers? How can we put them more in the lead of these things without taking all the risk and having the negative consequences? What would your take be of that? Well,
I think we talked about personality. I think it's very important that you find people that you collaborate with that are to a certain extent, that they are honest in a way about contributions, and that they want to give you the credits for all the hard work you did. So it's something that you, if you work in I think you really have to choose well who are you going to collaborate with. And if you have such a supervisor who wants to take all the credits, I think you should really think twice if you want to continue this work with this person. So you have a responsibility yourself about on the one hand choosing your supervisor, and on the other hand making this transparent. And a application plan is of course a form of transparency that you show to the others and show to your supervisor and all the other authors. Hey, this is what we're going to do. I'm going to be the first author on this paper, and that you discuss this explicitly in the whole team, because otherwise, that's one of the big problems. If you keep it vague about contribution, then everything in the end can happen. But if you make it very clear, then this vagueness disappears, and you really have discussed it well with the whole team.
So prevention is key. Publication plan might help.
Yeah.
But picking your boss, your supervisor, your collaborator wisely is the most important preventive measure. It's not easy, and people don't feel free to do so always, but you should really carefully look around whether this is a person you want to work with or not. Yeah. Because some people get into difficulties all the time. That's what you seem to suggest. Yeah. Okay, with this optimistic upbeat, I'd like to thank you again, Joeri, for this important contribution to today's program. And we move back again to Tamarinde. It has been alluded to already. She will now talk about how to teach supervisors to become a good supervisor. She did that as part of her PhD program together with Joeri as well. And I look forward to what the evaluation yielded and what you can say about that program. The floor is yours. Take your time.
Thank you. So indeed, it is my honor to talk about the pilot training that we developed, but I want to start out by saying that I did not do this work alone, and that the two women on this slide have been really instrumental in the successful small pilot. So on the left, you see Dr. Louise Menne, and on the right, you see Maaike Mulder, and you'll learn throughout my story how important they have become. And first, a brief outline again. I'll dwell a little bit on the relationship between supervision and research integrity. And I'm aware it's already been alluded to, but I want us to talk specifics. I'll say a bit about how we developed the particular training and how my PhD project has played a role in the development of that training, how we evaluated this small pilot training, what sort of methodology we used and what we didn't do. And I'll also say, or give you a sneak preview of our results that we also garner in different ways. And hopefully that should give us plenty of time for discussion, Q&A, and give me the option to talk a little bit about the current implementation of this training program. Now, why talk about supervision in the context of research integrity? And why talk about wanting to train supervisors to become better supervisors? But maybe first, let's get some definitions out of the way. So, Bird already in 2001 made a distinction between the supervisor or the advisor, she said, on the one hand, and the mentor on the other hand. And the supervisor or the advisor is often a more formal role that's assigned to a researcher, and it's their responsibility to get the PhD candidate over that sort of hurdle of obtaining their doctorate. Whereas the mentor, also how the word originally arose, is much more a person that's supposed to care for the PhD candidate and care about their professional development and give advice. And in the Netherlands, it is the case that PhD students often get assigned something that we call a day-to-day supervisor. So that person is not a full professor, but they're the first point of contact for the PhD students. And our focus of the training is on those supervisors, and if you will, a little bit on how they can become good mentors. Now, the relation between supervision and research integrity goes at least in two directions. So One is that particular styles of supervising may actually increase the chances of the PhD candidates engaging in research misbehavior. And, you know, one of those lines of reasoning comes from looking at the Office of RI cases where they found PhD candidates guilty of fabrication or falsification. And some of these authors have looked into, okay, what was the role of the supervisors in those cases? And they found that often supervision had been inadequate. The supervisor didn't check the data of the PhD candidate, and the supervisor failed to set any standards for good research practice. And it's in those cases that many people have argued shouldn't the supervisor have been co-responsible. And maybe a little bit along those lines, we and others have also labelled insufficient supervision itself a research misbehaviour because it's a deviation from the professional norm of adequate supervision. But of course, I'm also here to tell you a positive story. So there is also some evidence, at least, that we think that supervision may help in fostering research integrity. So supervisors that explicitly discuss research integrity with their PhD students, or supervisors that are very well versed in the responsible conduct of research and do all their work in a very open and transparent fashion, they can be a role model for PhD students. And a little bit related, when Antes and colleagues interviewed researchers that were considered exemplars in the responsible conduct of research, what these exemplars told us is that what had been very important for them in doing that well was possessing good interpersonal skills. And they talked about how they invested in their listening skills and how they saw their PhD candidates first and foremost as humans. And a somewhat similar thing appeared when they interviewed the Nature Mentoring in Science Award recipients. And these recipients also emphasized how they had really invested in discussing mistakes and trying to foster an open atmosphere and trying to be vulnerable themselves. So the image that we see appearing here is that we want supervisors to talk about research integrity. We want them that they are themselves familiar with these principles for responsible conduct of research and these new transparent methodologies. And we want them to have the necessary interpersonal skills to discuss these precarious issues. And it's against this background that me and some others have been working on developing a pilot training for supervisors that we called Superb Supervision. And as I already alluded to, it was part of my PhD project that looked into the research climate for integrity. And on this slide, I've just noted some of the findings that we came across when doing our research in the form of surveys and focus groups that fed into the pilot directly. So we learned that perceptions of the research climate differ heavily, and that the more senior the researcher across the board, the rosier their views of the climate for integrity, the less sort of aware they may be of direct problems. We also learned that insufficient supervision is really commonly perceived among academics in Amsterdam, and that researchers across academic ranks and disciplinary fields seemed concerned about it. And when we conducted focus groups to learn about, okay, how can we then create a better climate, various researchers emphasized discuss expectations. This really matters. Also when it comes to what is it to do a PhD, what is it to be a good supervisor. And many supervisors also confided that I've never had training in supervision. I'm just doing it. I'm thrown in the deep end. And in contrast to maybe other or more corporate work atmospheres, there's no sort of assessment if you're ready to supervise, or no coaching if you start supervising. And this really puzzled us. But we did realize we are not a good team to develop a supervision training on our own. Maybe we don't have very good interpersonal skills ourselves. And that's why we teamed up with Dr. Engineer Louise Menne, who was an established trainer already in the context of perhaps leadership training and those sort of matters, specifically for academic researchers. And we had a lot of discussions about what are the sort of necessary soft skills, interpersonal skills, and how can we convey them in a good way that really prompts people to explore these for themselves. And in the meantime, we also checked all of the available course material in the Netherlands. And the most striking finding here was that although many universities and university medical centres do offer voluntary programs for professionalisation for supervisors, there was actually none that really focused on research integrity or mentioned the topic at all. And while we're developing this, on then still the other side of my workplace, namely the VU University Medical Centre still at that point, the teacher professionalisation group was looking into similar issues. They had been given the assignment of updating their training programme for supervisors, and we teamed up. And similarly, the then still Amsterdam University Medical Center, the folks from their graduate school were actually fairly unhappy with the enrollment numbers in their current courses, and they also thought that a new course might do a better job there. So we teamed up, and these people have been involved in our development. So what did that look like? We worked on a 3-day training program, and you'll see the sort of 3 pillars that I've already dwelled upon. So the first day was focused on creating a good relationship. And if I made something slightly greenish, then it means that I think that this topic particularly pertained to research integrity. But you'll see that on every day we touched on both pillars. So we talked about dilemmas. We made them bring in their own dilemmas and discuss some of these. We had a lot of sessions on creating a good working climate and how expectations really mattered. We invested in their listening skills, in giving feedback and coaching, and very importantly, in distinguishing what is a good situation to give feedback and when it might be a better time to go for coaching. And in the end, they formed a small peer learning groups so that in between the days, they could already practice by themselves. And the next day, we focused on really conveying this responsible conduct of research, so they got to explore pre-registrations and preprints, for example. And we talked, akin to Joeri just did, about making a publication plan. And then they got to experience with actors, which is always the part that participants are most nervous about, but that they love most in the end. They could bring their own dilemma, their own research integrity dilemma, and they could play it out with the actor using the skills that they had learned the day before. And this was phenomenal to observe. And finally, we talked about them as a supervisor, touching upon their own personal pitfalls, also on role models, how they could become their own role model, and how they could sort of deal with stress and recognizing an imposter syndrome within their PhD candidate. Now, to evaluate this pilot training, we were very ambitious. We had a lot of different things in mind. But the first thing we did was we sent out questionnaires. And here, what's most interesting about this, we used the rescue questionnaire that's currently being validated by a different group, so I won't go into detail here. But we asked the addressees of our participants' PhD candidates. And then we asked the supervisor to rate themselves and their PhD candidate, but we also asked their supervisees or their PhD candidates to rate themselves and their supervisor. And then after each pilot training day, we also wanted to get some direct feedback. Was it relevant? What did you learn? Was it too long? Was it much too short? So they got to fill in like small process evaluations here. And finally, at the end, we wanted to know from them as a group, what was your true impression also as a group? How did this work? Did you see the synergy between the pillars that we tried to set up? And what do we still need to consider when we would like to further implement this? And this was done through small focus groups. Now, here you see a table of our participants that took part in the pilot training. And before I go any further, I have a few warning signs that I've put up here very deliberately. One is that what I'm going to show you in the next couple of slides is not, and I'm not proclaiming it is, a measure of effect or the effectiveness of our training. We're merely looking at perceptions. And the second one is that you should be aware that before the training curriculum, there was about 20 supervisors and 23 PhD candidates that completed these surveys. And after, it was only 11 supervisors and 11 of their PhD candidates. So please have those numbers in mind so you can take it with a pinch of salt. So mostly showing it to get us to have good discussion. So these were the questions we had for the survey participants. And this is the question that we asked the supervisors. We asked them to rate to what extent they agreed with this, that they acted as a mentor, an advisor, and a voice of reason for their PhD candidate. And this is what they indicated before. Again, this is rated on a scale from 1 to 5, very familiar to all of you, and 5 being totally agree. And you can see, here you see their results after. But maybe a little bit more interestingly for you and me, what did the PhD candidates say? So we also asked them, you know, does your supervisor act as a mentor, an advisor, a voice of reason? And again, they were already fairly positive, perhaps a little bit more positive, but it's hard to see true differences here, and I want to keep on stating that. Then another very important interpersonal skill that we focused on was the providing feedback in a clear way. And here we see before that people were perhaps not so sure about this, and afterwards they at least seemed to be a little bit more certain when it came to their self-perception that they did this in a structured and clear manner. And this is echoed to some extent by what their PhD candidates seem to report. Then we also wanted to know to what extent they were already applying some of these practices for good research or for responsible research. So we wanted to know, okay, are they stimulating their PhD candidates to pre-register their work? And some did, a little bit more did after. And again, you see a similar sort of pattern among the PhD candidates. And the final thing we asked was about preprints. And I know there's a lot already said about preprints also this morning, but you have to keep in mind that we did this work in 2019. So it was still a little bit more of a thing then, whether you were an early adopter. And again, we see something of a little bit of a growth happening here, also on the side of what the PhD candidates seems to perceive in the way in which they were encouraged to apply these practices for responsible research themselves. Now, I already mentioned that we also asked people after each day what they found, what their impressions were. And here I'm showing two numbers, which is namely, what was their impression overall on a scale from 1 to 10, and then 10 being it was phenomenal, and 0 or 1, sorry, being that it was terrible, and to what extent it fulfilled their expectations. But something much more important that we did, also for the implementation of the work, and because we wanted to give feedback to the AMC and the VUMC, was that we asked researchers for something that we call testimonials. And here I put on one of the testimonials that we got. And it was these sort of stories that really persuaded the now Amsterdam University Medical Centers to add our pilot training to their curriculum. So this person talks about how they explored propositions on the topic of research integrity, how they practice situations, how she learned here about giving the best examples, her own pitfalls. And as I already alluded to, she talks about the meeting with actors and how these actors were really confrontative, how escape was not possible, but also how everyone showed improvements within that single session. And she said that the importance of good mentoring is highlighted from different angles, and she encourages everyone to take our training. Now, the focus group results are actually a nice nuance to some of these very, very positive things that I put on the next slide. So we first inquired with people, okay, but what's your impression now overall? And they said it was eye-opening, it was intense, and it was great to also learn from my peers. And I guess the sort of eye-opening was more about what sort of different techniques are out there, what sort of practices are out there, how particular things that they may do in their behavior, how they may influence their PhD candidate. But I was personally curious to know a little bit more about what would that intensity part then be. And actually what people said is that the intensity also pertained not just to the amount of stuff that we crammed in a day, but to the type of learning that people engaged in. So it was much more also emotional learning that they had to go through. And one of the candidates phrased it as follows, and he says that I don't get asked about these questions, these kind of emotional questions as well. And he recalls an incident in the first morning, they had to do the listening exercise, the real listening. And he said those sort of exercises, I never did that before, that was pretty intense. And that's why it was draining, but I also learned a lot. And he talks about how he will start supervising soon and how he's very happy to have these sort of tools so that he knows what to do when he starts, he feels more prepared. And then we were, of course, interested in, okay, we tried to make this synergy, right, between research integrity, responsible conduct of research, these interpersonal skills. Did it all match up? Did people feel that it was connected? Did they see the synergy? And the overall feeling of the group was, yes, absolutely, you can even keep it more focused. And I think that's a lesson for all of us, that we can even draw those connections stronger, that they're not separate facets, but that they're really, really deeply intertwined and connected. But a lot of participants did emphasize that they could see that the interpersonal skills that they learned about giving feedback and coaching and listening and setting expectations can help prevent some of the challenging situations. But there was one participant that actually also saw it the other way around, how doing research responsibly can help prevent emotional problems. And he put it in this way. And he said that he thinks that by combining these sort of open science practices and the good people skills, you basically alleviate on the one side the shit that you have to deal with, and you become better at the shit that you have to deal with on the other side. And I always quite like this quote. And finally, of course, when we started this program, and it was already alluded to in a discussion before, we were playing with the idea of mandating it a little bit. And I think you have to forgive us for that. But when you develop something, you become a real believer and you think everyone should do this. But our focus group participants had a more nuanced views. And they would say, make it recommended, but don't mandate it. And some of them played with the idea of nudging. So they said, you know, maybe there could be an emphasis by the department head, or maybe if you want to make promotion, then following this course should become a prerequisite. So what has this taught us? And I think it can be summarized in, yes, it can be mutually reinforcing, but we still need to do work and we need to keep on improving our curricula here. And the other thing it personally learned me is that perhaps making a supervision training like this mandatory indeed is not the way forward. And I know that there are other countries or other universities out there. I know of, I think, Copenhagen and Leuven that have recently made research integrity training also compulsory for their PhD supervisors. But I think it depends a lot on what the goal of the training is here. And if the goal is bringing across awareness about particular principles, then perhaps making something mandatory can work, and I can see that. But if the goal is an invitation for people to grow as a person and to grow in their own sort of soft skills, I am much more willing to take the advice of my focus group participants seriously. Now, before we round off, there are a few things, of course, that should be said, because I have primarily focused on the relationship between the supervisor and the supervisee, but that doesn't stand in isolation. So there are indications that particular research climates may bring about particular ways of supervising. So yes, people can go to your brilliant course, but they still land home in the real world. And this is something we have to be mindful of. And another thing, and I've cheekily put here, it takes a village, is that a lot of the things I talked about rely on this sort of model of there is the supervisor and the PhD candidate. And this is in many contemporary contexts, it's actually not true. There's much more of a group mentoring already going on. And this is something that Roberts et al. Have also worked with and explored, where it's different people within a research team that are in some way responsible for the supervision or that will be role models in particular kinds for a PhD candidate. And before we round off, I should reiterate, I did not present you any measures of effect. And I also think that in the survey and in the process evaluation results that I show you, there's of course a fair chance that there's a big volunteer bias in there. These people voluntarily gave up 3 days of their busy life as scientists to come take our course. So it's somewhat expected that they'll have a little bit more positive view already towards this. And there's something I would like us to think about as a group, because I have focused on perceptions, but it's my gut feeling that if we're looking into potential effectiveness of this training, we would also want to think about evaluating not just perceptions, but also behaviors. And something that we have been talking about in our group is, wouldn't it be fantastic to do longitudinal work and to then maybe compare a cohort of PhD students whose supervisors had followed our training and contrast them with sort of in a case control-like design with supervisors or PhD candidates that had supervisors that did not do any additional training in this matter. But it's also a question to you, the audience. What would really persuade you that training programs like this were effective in making supervisors more responsible supervisors? And I'm really curious to learn from you. Thank you very much. And before we close off, one more thing that I'll leave it on, because we're very, very proud, is these are the current implementation numbers. At the Amsterdam University Medical Center, there are 2 types of our training offered. There's a little bit more than 80 supervisors that took it already. The University of Amsterdam, we're almost at 50. And just this year, we started at the Twente University with a new pilot, and it makes us incredibly proud. And I'm hoping that that's going to help to prevent more situations like this. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for raising this really important topic of supervision, superb supervision. This morning we already started by saying that supervision might be a very important driver of behavior of researchers, for the good and for the bad. And your course, of course, was aimed at improving the good behavior and decreasing the bad behavior. And it was really interesting to see you doing this course and taking this initiative together with the other people. It's not that common that a PhD student is teaching supervisors how to supervise. You taught Joeri and me also a nice lesson along the way. That was quite engaging. It's really nice that you did this course. Some people asked, what did these supervisors find most difficult in the task as supervisor? Did you get a feeling of that? What is, you know what is most difficult for a PhD student, but what is most difficult for a supervisor? Did you get a flavor from your experience there?
There are two particular examples that come to mind instantly. One is the struggle of learning that not everyone is like you. And that it was a struggle that many supervisors expressed, that they came with, whether they were aware of it or not, they came with particular expectations of what a good PhD candidate is like, namely themselves, in many, many cases. And then they had to work with people that are tremendously different, that may have very different priorities, very different working styles. And that has been a huge challenge for many of them. And another thing I think they found really difficult, and this pertains more maybe to the topic of research integrity, was especially when we talked about things like making a publication plan, that they also realized we don't work in isolation. I may be the day-to-day supervisor, I'm the assistant professor, but there's still a full professor looking over my shoulder. And maybe this person has very different ideas. And how do I mitigate the situation with my co-authors, even if all I want to do is advocate on behalf of my PhD candidate? And the interesting part is that even here, some of the participants said that the interpersonal skills you taught me for better working or better handling communications with my PhD candidate have also helped me to better handle communication with my own boss and my colleagues, which I think is a nice note.
These bosses are almost human. It's really interesting. Suzanne van der Vastenhorst, there's an interesting question as well for you. She's working in Rotterdam University, like you know, and she says, well, in our place, we have separate courses. One for the interpersonal skills, the soft skills, you label them, another one for supervisors, how to promote research integrity in your pupils. Why merge? Why not separate? And her question is literally, should we merge as well, and why?
I'm going to say straight up, that might be a great investment. Let's just merge them all together. And I think the reason is because as I've tried to show, you know, both in the literature and the work by Anders et al. And Kleins et al., but also from our own experience, is that the two can mutually reinforce one another. That having good interpersonal skills can be really helpful when it comes to discussing these precarious debates about authorship, or it can be really helpful in creating an atmosphere where your PhD candidate dares to question you and dares to maybe admit that he or she or they made a mistake. And if you don't have that sort of atmosphere of psychological safety, then a lot of learning may be lost, but also a lot of mistakes will remain uncovered. Yeah. Or they will remain forever a secret because people just felt like, but if I bring this up, my boss will be angry. And I think many more PhD students still think this. If I tell that I made a mistake, if I tell that I didn't think this is going to work, or if I challenge my supervisor, I don't think this is the right methodology, or I want to go the extra mile in Preregister, they'll be angry with me. And if that is the situation, then they're in severe need of interpersonal training in science.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really strong point. So they reinforce each other in a good way. You need one skill to utilize the other and the other way around. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. There are more interesting issues. Did the course deal with handling the system of science as well, in the sense of it entailing perverse incentives? For instance, rewarding authorships, rewarding citations, rewarding getting a lot of grants. You talked about this PhD supervisor being the sandwich between the boss and a pupil, but there is also the system of science, and this PhD supervisor wants a career of its own, like the PhD students want. What is the role of handling perverse incentives in that sense in your course?
Well, it played a role in different ways. So I think it was a particularly prevalent topic when we talked about stress and when we talked about imposter syndrome, but we also talked about stress within these PhD supervisors' lives and within how do you make sure that you sort of raise your PhD candidate in a way responsibly, but you also don't want to shield them from all that sort of system of science that is out there. And it's this sort of delicate battle where I don't have a quick fix, but I found it really illuminating to hear these different supervisors share the strategies for what they did. And I think it also played a role in the types of dilemmas that we tried these supervisors to think about, because sometimes they think, I've never had a research integrity dilemma. Some even sat to us afterwards. I just wanted to do a course on supervision. I didn't quite know if we wanted to go to talk about research integrity for 3 days. Wouldn't have liked that. And I think by showing them these sort of dilemmas, it also made them think about, but this is my middle role, and we are in this system, and how do I navigate this? And in the session of talking about expectations, it also became particularly well known among our group members that in this complex system of science, you sometimes have to do things for the sort of reasons of this is how science works. And something that I found really illuminating there was how it became very evident. Talk about this with your PhD candidate. Take them along. Tell them, we might have to add this author now because I'm trying to secure a particular fund with this person, and hopefully that fund can also help you in a way. But take them along in this, so that even if you have to make the choice, or even if you feel pushed by the sort of perverse incentives, that you took them along in that reasoning process. And I really think that that degree of openness, which again requires a particular psychological safety, also that you feel free as a supervisor to share these sort of things, is really, really helpful here.
And again, it shows how these interpersonal skills may help there. You want to respond to this one as well, Joeri?
Yeah, an additional point to raise there is that what the supervisors also do, they learn from each other. So they are together in this group, but they also organize intervision sessions, and they continue with the intervision sessions. And that is really help them to see, hey, how do the other supervisors do it, and what can I learn from them to improve those skills. So I think that's an additional point that's really helpful also to navigate these difficult issues. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you know, Tamarinde, just a short question in between, what happened to these intervision groups? Do some still exist?
I at least know of 2 to still exist, yes. I'm not super familiar with the novel ones that we started, but I know a few are still existing. And even if it's not the entire peer group, then it's still a few people that meet every now and then. And maybe it's nice to then add that what they had to do in these peer groups was bring their own dilemma and then getting feedback from the group, because the group, of course, had also all learned about all these different skills. And I must say that when we saw the sort of feedback forms, that this was actually something people quite appreciated. Yeah. And again, I still know that one or two are still going on.
Yeah, but still, it's a proof of principle in a way. Eh? That's the idea. You're going to like this one. Sauvik Dasgupta, he turns upside down your question, how should we investigate efficacy? He already believes it is effective. You have been convincing. But he says, what is effective if you now convince all the other universities to adopt this course and start working in that direction? And he's wondering, how can you do that? What would be a good strategy to engage other universities, maybe to make PhD students demand that their supervisor takes the course or something like that? Do you have any ideas on that? It's more or less a marketing talk already, so go on.
That is a very challenging one. And I think, to some extent, we're seeing a shift already happening. And I think that by mentioning that there are already 3 institutions in the Netherlands that like this program, and the fact that we've also been invited to give these sort of courses abroad shows the increasing interest. And I don't know, if we're talking rebellious already, why don't all the PhD students strike as a collective and just demand that they only go back to work if their supervisors actually also invest in themselves?
Yeah, that's a quite radical one, but it might work. It might indeed work. And that's another point. Maya is raising that. You say, well, this is nice. You need to set aside 3 days. It's optional. It's not mandatory. Are you not afraid that only the people who need it less go to your course? And you are against making it mandatory, if I understood you correctly. Maybe you should be more stricter and make it mandatory.
Yeah, it's a good point. And I actually remember that when we raised this issue in the focus groups, the majority of people was against making it mandatory. But there was one person that maybe touches on Maya's point that said, do you know how many hours you supervise people? Do you know how much hassle you go through? Setting aside 3 days is nothing. And he also said, even if people don't want it from the start, if they have to do it anyways, and you make a really good program, just tell them how much time it's going to save them, and they might still come. So I would like to say, as a scientist, that we should evaluate this. But for that, I do need a good measure of efficacy. So I'm hoping to see more responses here, because I think it's possible to evaluate this. Can we see what sort of happens if you make it purely voluntary, if you make it mandatory? What sort of change are we going to see?
Yeah. Joeri.
Well, and there are more ways how you can do that, because this is about the course. And as you know, in the SOPSRI project, we develop guidelines for supervision, and then from an institutional perspective, of course. So in these guidelines that we're currently finalizing, we see not only that training is essential for supervisors, but that we also see that other points that should be organized by institutions to improve it, such as, for example, supervision agreements. And in these agreements, you sign together a supervisor and a PhD student how you want to fill in the supervision. What do you want to do exactly with the supervision? So that's one thing. And the other thing is that you create a culture that supervisors talk with each other about potential problems, about the things that go well and need to be improved. So in these guidelines, I think there's an important role for institutions as well to foster a climate of good supervision. And the training is of course, an essential element, but it's one of the things that an institution can do.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. This is interesting as well. Maya is writing back. You posed a great question, but it was not my question. So I'll try again.
Okay.
That can happen, of course. I apologize to you. Her point was, let me say it correctly now, it's not about making it mandatory, but rather evaluation of incentives. What would help people to join the course or not to join the course when it's still optional? What would make it more attractive to PhD supervisors? You mentioned a little bit about that. Are there some other ideas you can put out of the cupboard?
So I'm thinking that it could be a way of sort of making your own profile as a researcher more unique and more suitable. And I think that we already see this in sort of different grant applications nowadays, that you may no longer focus on only your publications. And I think that by demonstrating that you voluntarily took part in some of these courses or trainings can actually indicate that you have already gone that sort of extra mile, and that it may be a selling point for these individuals. Also, when it comes to wanting to obtain grants, and this is why, especially because our program focused primarily on novel supervisors, it may be that they may soon apply for getting a grant of an entire research group. How fantastic is it that you can indicate that you've already taken this topic seriously, you've considered it seriously, you've taken this course and you can demonstrate it. So I hope that's also a way in which we can incentivize individuals to partake, to showcase that they're really the good scientists that they believe they are.
Yeah, well, you obviously believe, and that's nice, of course, in carrots more than in sticks. But there are sticks as well. You can also withdraw the right to supervise when people are not willing to take the course optional. That's like COVID vaccination. You can decide whether you get it or not, but if you don't get it, like in France, you cannot visit the pub or the restaurant. Would that be a way to go, or would that be too strict and severe?
I don't have a clear-cut answer. What I'm going to say is that I don't really know if you can beat interpersonal skills in with a stick. I haven't seen any studies that demonstrate the effectiveness in that. And up to that point, I'm going to stand with my focus group participants that say, yes, if your goal is purely to give people more knowledge, then use the stick. But if your goal is that people themselves become different persons, almost, if you will, I don't believe in the beating strategy.
Good point. I like your answer. Iris Lechner, she has a modern take to it. She says now, well, supervision through Zoom and other programs is probably there to stay. We experienced it during the COVID pandemic, and we're still experiencing it. Do supervisors need additional or other skills to do it online? What is your take? It's not part of the course. The course is, I guess, still face-to-face, but or maybe all online. Are there skills online that need to be taught additionally?
Well, not so much skills online. What I can say is that we have talked about this because the last few editions have been online. And I think that what they also found is that it requires almost your interpersonal skills to be trained to an even higher degree, right? Because here you are from behind the screen trying to communicate to your PhD student, I really trust you. Or you try to give feedback and, normally you can read a room, now you can only read a screen. That is much more difficult. So we have had a lot of conversations about what can you then do and how can you use maybe the techniques that we tried to teach you in still asking those sort of questions. But what I can actually tell you is also what they said, it just requires harder work, especially when it comes to creating a sort of an atmosphere of safety. It requires harder work. And I also want to say to all the supervisors out there, it also still requires tuning in. If you don't meet on the lab, if you don't meet on a sort of weekly basis, and we're all chuffed with meetings. We're all stuck in meetings all the time. But don't forget these people. Really, really don't, because normally you would meet them anyways and you would see if particular things were going on and you would see if things were going well. And I know this is more challenging in a virtual landscape, but please do it. Don't forget these people and check in regularly.
Yeah, good point, really good point. This is interesting as well. Mr. Reuven, and that might be one for you, Joeri, as well. Mr. Reuven says, well, this is nice, teaching supervisors how to become a good supervisor. What about teaching PhD students to become a good PhD students? Don't we need an equivalent course for PhD students? And we do something on research integrity, but more on the domain of interpersonal skills. And I know that Joeri wrote a book on it, so maybe Tamarinde first, and then Joeri can add examples from the book.
I like it. I would hope, I don't have a clear-cut answer yet to what particular skills, but I can think of some, and especially when it comes to the matters that we discussed pertaining to expectation management, a supervisor can, reasonably convey his or her or their expectation, but it also requires the PhD candidate to do so. Because very often they may feel incredibly disappointed in their supervisor, but they never told the poor person what they actually expected. They just thought that was natural. So at least when it comes to communicating expectations, I would love to see courses for research integrity focusing more on that. And I also think that we go more and more towards not focusing on the misconduct, but focusing on the empowerment of researchers. And I think this is one of the ways, and I think we're going to learn more about this tomorrow morning as well, where the empowerment of PhD students to also clearly convey these sort of expectations can really help. So I definitely agree with Meerte.
Good point. Joeri.
Well, we always allude to this beautiful small booklet called 2 to Tango from Maastricht University. And it gives 10 golden rules for supervisors, but also 10 golden rules for PhD students. And I think there is, it really takes 2 to tango. So a PhD student has a certain responsibility to raise up issues, to talk about expectations, to talk about goals, to talk about what is expected from me, what is your role, to talk about how supervision is formed, what you can expect in supervision, what you cannot expect in supervision. So exactly this empowerment is so important for PhD students. What are their rights? How should they behave? What are the unwritten rules? All these kind of things that you have to learn from the one hand from your supervisor, but that you also have to invest in yourself. So there's a huge responsibility for the PhD student as well to make a supervision work. It's not only the supervisor who needs to behave, but the PhD student also needs to behave, because it's a mutual agreement that you go on. So I really like the point about empowerment and about responsibility. You can do a lot as a PhD student, really so much more than you think. Of course, you're to a certain degree dependent, but you can do also a lot yourself. And I think that should also be a focus of a supervisor. Okay, we should foster this autonomy of a PhD student. We should really empower it, so it will become actually an independent researcher after 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And it reminds me of something that one of my mentors told me. When you are supervising a PhD student, you need to steer with one hand on your back. Yeah. And when you're a department head, you have to steer with 2 hands behind your back. So you need to empower other people to do the work. That is important. And we are social beings. You already alluded to it, Tamarinde, that these intervention groups flourish because there is interaction between people struggling with the same issues. Isn't that the case for PhD students as well? To me, it's more or less almost criminal to have one PhD somewhere in splendid isolation. You need a bunch of them. And when you have enough, you can hold back as supervisor because these people help each other.
Yes, I believe so, although I also wouldn't want to mandate a practice like this because it would prevent the starting of potentially brilliant research groups.
I'm just trying to be provocative, but you pick it up.
Yeah, I do believe that the sort of peer learning that can happen there can be really, really empowering. And what I also know from what these supervisors told us in these peer learning groups is that it can be also quite refreshing to learn that other people struggle with the same things that you struggle with. And I just think that points to a sort of larger issue in science that maybe this is an invitation also to talk a little bit more about these sort of struggles. That in a world where, you know, maybe all supervision seems to go well and all people seem to only publish perfect papers and you cannot replicate matters, can we have a little bit more of an open discussion about the struggles that we face here?
Yeah. We've come to an end of an interesting discussion and 3 interesting papers. I'd like to thank you again, both of you. Please stay on. There is not that much public in the audience, so it's nice to have the 2 of you here, but there are many there out. We move on to the next speaker, and that is, we don't move on to the next speaker. We have a coffee break. We've deserved a coffee break. That's great. Quarter of an hour, we start again at 4 o'clock. See you back then.